Good afternoon, everyone. I think we can begin today's program. I am Jonathan Brent, Executive Director of the YIVO Institute, and it's really a great honor to us to be able to honor Ambassador Mal Berisha for the work that he has been doing on the papers of Herman Bernstein in the YIVO archive, but in a larger way also to bring here to the YIVO Institute the truly great story of Albanian-Jewish relations during World War II. It is a subject, I must confess, that I have become acquainted with in some detail only through the work of Ambassador Berisha. In most accounts of the Holocaust, I think the history of Albania during those tragic years is reduced to a paragraph, a footnote, a short summary. I'm not aware of a single major study of this phenomenon, and it is truly a great phenomenon of this small country resisting the tremendous pressure that was placed upon it by the fascist powers of Europe, in defense of a defenseless people whom it could as easily have sacrificed as any of the other countries of Europe. The number of rescuers of Jews throughout Europe is something on the order of 0.0% of the population. It is infinitesimally small in Poland, in Lithuania, anywhere. But in Albania, it was 100% of the population. And we have to look at that with awe today, particularly given the circumstances in our world now, in which Islam is being demonized as anti-Semitic, as exclusionary, as a dominating ideology. But what we see in Albania is that this, one of the great world religions, can be inclusive, can be embracing of humanity. And under the right circumstances, it is possible to achieve in this small space what was not achieved anywhere else in the world. And so I just want to say those few words in introduction because I was touched so much by what Ambassador Berisha wrote in the pamphlet that is available on the booth outside. And I urge all of you who have not read it, if you are not acquainted with this history, to read it. Those of you who are historians here, I think you should direct your students or direct your colleagues or direct yourself toward a more in-depth analysis of this extraordinary phenomenon of Albania during World War II. And so that's really all that I wanted to say in welcome. I want to thank very much Fruma Moore, Mila, who is the head of our senior archivist, Lyudmila Sholachova, who is the head of our archives and library, and Helena Gindi for making this program possible. I want to thank the family of Ruth Gay for their generosity in supporting this program, and to welcome those members of the Gay family who are here. Thank you very much. Fruma will now make a proper introduction. Thank you very much.
Just before we start, I just want to ask everybody to please close your cell phones. So if you haven't closed your cell phone, we'd really appreciate it, because we don't want it interfering with the program. Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to greet everybody here today. For YIVO, as Jonathan Brent just said, for YIVO, this is a very important event. It's not just an event about the YIVO archives and about YIVO documents, because it's an event which brings together two peoples, and it brings together facts of history that were never before narrated in the way that it will be today. And so we're all very, very pleased to be here and to host this event. Together with Mila Shalochova, who is the head librarian and acting chief archivist, I'd like to welcome everyone here today to the Ruth Gay Seminar in Jewish Studies, which will be presented by the Honorable Mal Berisha, Albanian ambassador to the United Kingdom and Ireland. And I thank everyone in the audience for joining us today for the program on Herman Bernstein and Albanian-Jewish relations. We are very pleased to extend a warm welcome to members of the Albanian community, including VATRA, the Pan-Albanian Federation of America, and members of the Albanian American Television and Press, as well as members of the Eye Contact Foundation, which was instrumental in producing the film Besa, the Promise, which is a documentary film about the rescue of Jews by the Albanians during World War II. And I would also like to recognize members of the Israeli and Albanian diplomatic corps who RSVP'd that they were coming, and I believe that some of them are here today with us. My warmest greetings to Mr. Mal Berisha and his wife, Donica, and their children and family members and very close friends who are here today. Mr. Berisha and his wife flew to New York from London this past Friday in order to be with us today, so he's made a really special trip. And some of you have heard about the shutdown of the airport in London this past Friday, where thousands of flights were canceled and people were stranded. And apparently, Mr. Berisha missed this shutdown just by a couple of hours. He happened to be in the air with his wife when this happened, so that's why we're fortunate to have this event today. Before introducing the ambassador, I would like to express my thanks and appreciation to the family of Ruth Gay, whose generosity and support has made it possible for YIVO to organize the Ruth Gay Seminar Series in Jewish Studies, a series which provides an opportunity for researchers who have used the YIVO archives and the YIVO collections to share their findings with the public. The generous major gift to YIVO in 2008 by the family of Ruth Gay has enabled us to schedule a wide range of exciting and interesting lectures whose breadth and scope reflect the vast and rich holdings of the YIVO archives. I would like to greet and recognize members of Ruth Gay's family who are here with us today in the audience: Shirley Gorenstein, who's Ruth Gay's sister, and Elizabeth Glazer, daughter of Ruth Gay. We thank you very much for coming and for giving your support to this important program. Today's lecture is based on the story of Herman Bernstein's unique career as an American Jewish journalist, writer, and diplomat, and on his contribution during the 1930s to the warm and positive relationship between Albanians and Jews. Herman Bernstein was blessed with an extraordinary enthusiasm for life and was involved in many cultural, journalistic, and political affairs. His private papers were donated by the family to YIVO in the 1970s, and this extensive collection of correspondence, manuscripts, photographs, and clippings reflect the full breadth and excitement of Bernstein's biography. And we have with us here today in the audience Marek Webb, who was the archivist who actually received the Herman Bernstein papers when they arrived, and it was a massive collection. I wish I could show you some of the slides we took at the time, but that's for another lecture. But it was really a very exciting time for YIVO when this collection arrived, and the work that went into processing this collection and then creating the finding aid, and today the finding aid is online, is an important accomplishment for us. Ambassador Berisha visited the YIVO Institute this past March in order to study Bernstein's archive. His lecture today is primarily the result of his research at YIVO and as well as at some other repositories. For today's lecture, Mr. Berisha has prepared and printed a booklet which reflects the contents of the lecture in a more extensive and richer format. And each member of the audience will be handed a copy of this booklet on your way out after the lecture. So after this lecture ends, when you leave the auditorium, you will receive a copy of this booklet. I would just like to add that if you enjoy our programs and the work we do, we invite you to consider becoming a member of YIVO, and to register for YIVO membership today, you can visit the YIVO table in the Great Hall after the program. I'd like to express my special thanks to Jonathan Brent, Executive Director of YIVO, for his strong support of this program. Dr. Brent has spent the last few days in London and just came back from the airport and came straight here. So you may not have realized that when he came up here to speak, but it's really, it's not only a special effort, but as he was able to say in a few words, it's not only his special effort, but the fact that we all recognize the importance of this event. And I'd also like to thank Mila Shalochova, Head Librarian and Acting Chief Archivist, for her enthusiasm and for her encouragement of the seminar series. And finally, thanks to all members of the YIVO staff who worked with Mr. Berisha when he was here in March, and those staff members who have worked on today's event, and last but not least, the staff of the Center for Jewish History, including Michael Stafford, Melissa Manaya, and Jonathan Lamb, for helping to make today's event a success. After the lecture, we will run a 2-minute trailer of the film Bessa, The Promise, just to give you an idea of what this film is about. And for any information about this film in the Great Hall after the lecture, you can speak to the representative of the Eye Contact Foundation, who will give you information about where this can be shown. I know there's a synagogue in New Jersey who would like to show it, so you'll be able to find all the information you need about this film when you go out into the Great Hall. There will also be a Q&A period after the trailer, and there will be a reception after this lecture, and you are all cordially invited to attend the reception. A few words about Mr. Berisha. Ambassador Mal Berisha is Ambassador of the Republic of Albania to the United Kingdom and has been in that position since June 2013. He's also Ambassador non-resident to Ireland. Ambassador Berisha previously served as General Consul at the General Consulate of Albania in Istanbul, and as General Director of the Consular Department and then of the Department of Regional Affairs and Initiatives at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Tirana. Before working for the United Nations mission in Kosovo, Ambassador Berisha joined the Pan-Albanian Federation of America, VATRA, in 1998, contributing to extensive efforts of Albanian Americans to resolve the Kosovo question. Ambassador Berisha is also a scholar of historical subjects and has published many books and articles on Albanian history and culture. His latest publication, Charles Telford Erickson, A Life Dedicated to Albania, which was written in Albanian, is an extensive monograph on the life and work of the earliest 20th century American missionary who spent time in Albania studying the country and contributing a lot to the understanding of its culture. Mr. Berisha has also published articles and given talks on Jewish life in Albania and Jewish-Albanian relations internationally. I'd like to call upon Ambassador Mal Berisha to join us here at the podium.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining me today to this presentation. Dear Dr. Brandt, dear Fruma, dear friends of YIVO, it is a great pleasure to be here today and disclose one of the best stories that the Albanian history has ever recorded in regard with the humanity. Before starting, I would like to thank the people of this institution that have helped me to complete a study about Herman Bernstein, which I think is one of the prominent figures of the Jewish life that has contributed for Albania. And Albania, in return, has helped the Jews who were living in Albania or they were just sojourner through the country. I want to thank Mila Sholokova, Acting Chief Archivist of the YIVO, Mrs. Fruma Mohrer, Senior Archivist, the entire staff of YIVO, Ms. Etty Goldwasser for helping me with the PowerPoint. And last but not least, the family of Ruth Gay for the generous support of this lecture series. During my presentation, I'll show not only the contribution that Herman Bernstein has granted to Albania while he was minister, as he was called in that time, or ambassador of the United States, but I do a digression, starting from the very last day of his work in Albania. When he left Albania, he wrote in his memoirs the following paragraph. Tirana was to me for 3.5 years a most fascinating listening and observation post. I found that DAF Albania has often been referred to as one of the most sensitive danger zones in Europe. The Albanians are a peace-loving people, and the policy of the government is unquestionably a policy of peace in the Balkans. I visited practically every part of Albania and learned to know and to love your people whose simplicity, genuineness, hospitality, and kindness have left an indelible impression upon me. I am an Albanian. One of my best traditions I appreciate about my people is Besa. Besa in the Albanian Code of Honor, passed on from generation to generation. It guides our behavior towards guests, anyone in extreme need. Our moral code has been stated in this way. The Albanian home exists for the service of God and the sojourner. That is why the Albanian people sheltered and protected not only the Jews of its own country, but also the Jewish refugees being pursued by the Nazi Germans. About 3,000 Jews were saved in Albania. In fact, 69 Albanians have had their names inscribed at the Yad Vashem Memorial in Jerusalem, called Righteous Among the People. Albanian Muslims and Christians alike took the highest risk upon themselves to save their Jews. It has been my honor to highlight the life of the Jewish community in Albania over the last 22 years of my career as a diplomat, traveler, and scholar. The first man who told me the Jewish stories in Albania was John Freely, a professor of Bosphorus University in Istanbul. John is an Irish-American who teaches mathematics and also writes books about history. I met him in 1992 when I was serving as a Consul General of Albania. He told me the fantastic story of the lost Messiah, Sabbatai Zevi, who perished in Albania. Few people know this fact. Over the years, I became better acquainted with the history of Jews in Albania, which made me feel proud for what the people of my nation had done during the hardest part of their history for both Albanians and Jews. It was a time of Holocaust, yet no pogroms, no hate, no persecution, and no discrimination against the Jews were ever recorded in Albania. We are a small nation with a humble history and unique struggles, but we feel justified in feeling proud of our honorable dealings with our Jewish citizens and guests. In 1997, during a trip to the United States, I discovered a book by Harvey Sarner named Rescue in Albania, with introduction written by Honorary Joseph Dioguardi, former US Congressman and President of the Albanian-American Civic League, and two Jewish congressmen, Honorary Tom Lantos and Honorary Benjamin Gilman. The story was dusted off by Joe Dioguardi and Tom Lantos. The work fascinated me and I immediately translated it into Albanian. From that point, every story about Jewish life in Albania captivated my attention. Among these, one man's story became my favorite, that of Herman Bernstein. In 2012, I was appointed as a chargé d'affaires and 1 year later, ambassador of Albania to the United Kingdom in London. I met a 91-year-old lady named Scarlett Epstein, whom we sadly lost in the spring of 2014. Mrs. Epstein, formerly named Trude Grunwald in Austria, was a professor of anthropology, but above all a remarkable human being. She always made me feel proud when she would tell how she escaped from the Nazi Germans from Austria to Albania during 1938-1939, after the Kristallnacht. She enjoyed telling her story of escape in English universities, schools, and synagogues. On the day of her funeral, together with my staff of the embassy and my wife, we went to honor her, and the daughter, Debbie, addressed the audience as follows. Mom always kept telling us, say whatever you like, do whatever you want, but don't touch me on the part of my chest, pointing to her heart, because there is a button here, and if you press it, it will automatically start speaking like a doll, saying, Albania saved my life, Albania saved my life. During the years in London, I've been involved in participating, sometimes invited, sometimes as a key speaker, sometimes together with ambassadors of other European countries to different parts of the Jewish institutions, including the Vienna Library, which is, I think, you're like a sister of YIVO, to Pinner Synagogue, to Middlesex University, to the Jewish Festival, watching the Promise Besa, the Promise, the fantastic movie that we'll see the trailer at the end of this presentation. The American writer and Jewish daughter Gertrude Stein once said, history takes time, history makes memory. This is true. The most remarkable history of Jews saved in Albania has taken time to be illuminated. We have come to learn through the history and memories of those saved that Albania was one of the few European nations that had more Jews at the end of the Second World War than at the beginning. Not a single Jewish life was lost in that country, not even one. On the contrary, the number of Jews who were chased from the other European countries, mainly from Austria, Germany, and Yugoslavia, were sheltered in Albania, thus tripling Albania's Jewish population by the end of the World War II. Since then, many Jewish organizations, mainly in the United States and recently in London, Brussels, etc., jointly with Albanians, scholars, families of those who helped the Jews, and Jewish survivors, such as Professor Scarlett Epstein, Dr. Anna Cohen, Felicita Jack Coyle in Jerusalem, Johanna Newman, and Irene Grubman, have made efforts to unveil this story to the world. A small part of this dramatic story can be found at the life of the United States ambassador to the Kingdom of Albania from 1930 to 1933, the Russian-Lithuanian-American Jewish intellectual Herman Bernstein. As a diplomat, I have learned from Herman Bernstein that everything we write, even the notes we scribble and the business cards we exchange, is an important record to preserve. Here is the cover of the Bernsteins. Not doing well with this. So there is a large collection here, as Dr. Brent mentioned before. Herman Bernstein was the United States ambassador to Albania from 30 to 33, a period marked by Albanian struggle under King Zog to maintain its independence between Italy and Yugoslavia. Born to a Jewish family, he emigrated to the United States in 1893. There he worked as a journalist, writer, and translator of Russian literature, contributing material to the New York Evening Post, The Nation, and The Independent. He was editor of Jewish Tribune and the Jewish Daily Bulletin. He traveled to Europe as a correspondent of the New York Times, where he documented the situation of the Jews in Eastern Europe and covered the Russian Revolution for the New York Herald. Bernstein met Herbert Hoover at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 and supported the later bid for the presidency in 1928. His archives, including some writings on Albania, are preserved here at the YIVO Institute. Bernstein was a writer, and he has written a number of books. Among them is The Flight of Time, In the Gates of Israel, Contrite Hearts, Celebrities of Our Time, The Road to Peace, The History of a Lie, with Masterminds, Willie Nicky Telegrams, and Herbert Hoover, The Man Who Brought America to the World. Bernstein translated also a number of important literary works by figures such as Maxim Gorky, Leonid Andreev, Lev Tolstoy, and Ivan Turgenev. From Russian into English, his own plays The Mandarin and The Right to Kill were presented on Broadway. In 1915, Bernstein published a book, La Recta Gibulo, in the so-called universal language of Esperanto. It is a translation of the story The Straight Hunchback, which comes from Bernstein's In the Gates of Israel. Herman Bernstein soon became an intellectual par excellence. While traveling through Russia and Europe, he interviewed some of the greatest men of his time. The interviews with commentary were published in a book entitled With Masterminds. In his introduction, he writes, "It has been my good fortune to interview some of the masterminds of Europe, the foremost authors, scientists, philosophers, statesmen, and artists. It is interesting to note that in every interview with this famous man, Bernstein never fails to find a moment to ask about the situation of the Jews and their problems, especially in Tsarist Russia. He was a great Jew who served his people in the most faithful ways possible. I would like to quote some of his dialogues with some of these men in the following interviews. He went to Krasnaya Polyana to interview Leo Tolstoy. He asked him about the life of Jews in Russia. Tolstoy said, "All people are brethren. It is very sad and painful if we must make an effort to realize this. If there are any bad traits in the Russian Jews, they are called forth by the horrible persecution which we have subjected them. How do I account for the anti-Jewish feeling in Russia? We often dislike more those whom we harm than those who harm us. This is exactly true of the attitude of the Russian towards the Jews." Then Bernstein takes an interview from Count Sergius Witte, who once was the Prime Minister of Russia. The Prime Minister says, when I served under Alexander III, who was the most autocratic of Tsars, he said to me one day, Sergei Yulievich, is it true that you are so fond of the Jidi, a degraded name for the Jews? He answered, permit me to answer you by another question, I said. Could you gather all the Jews of Russia, place them in ships on the Black Sea, and sink the ships? You would not do that, would you? The Jews must live among us. Therefore, we must give them the opportunity to live as we do. In my opinion, the only way of solving the Jewish question is to give the Jews equal rights. Bernstein has also taken an interview from Mechnikov, who was the director of the Louis Pasteur Institute of France. In the interview, among other things, Bernstein pulls out Mechnikov's concepts about the Jews in Russia. The Russians, says Professor Mechnikov, have the mind, but the Russian Jews, in addition to that vivacity and energy to a remarkable degree, Russia has lost many great talents by persecuting the Jews. The Russian government will realize its errors and will improve the condition of the Jewish people for its own sake, if for no other reasons. Herman Bernstein was such a great journalist that he had the honor and privilege to interview big names of the 20th century, including George Bernard Shaw in London. George Bernard Shaw, his interviews are always focused on the concepts of the people interviewed. However, even in this case, he presses Shaw about his opinion on the Jewish question. Bernard Shaw answers, "This, I believe, is true everywhere. The Jew is intelligent, industrious, and hardworking, and when he makes a bargain, he knows what he is doing." Then he goes to Henry Bergson in France. He says, "I believe the Jewish question will be solved when the Jewish people will have attained equal rights in the countries where they are being persecuted. And the sooner that is attained, the better for the Jews, of course, and also for the countries where they live." Then he goes to August Rodin, who was considered like the Rembrandt of Chisel, the greatest sculptor of the 20th century. Bernstein asked the sculptor, "How about art and religion?" And Rodin says, "Art is like religion. And the best religion is that which gives happiness at the smallest cost, almost without money. Because, after all, the different way of happiness are chiefly intellectual." Then he goes to Havelock Ellis, the philosopher. Bernstein continues his journey to Brixton in England. He was an activist of women rights. Both men spoke about suffrage when England still forbade women to vote. Bernstein's interview with this English thinker is one of the best of all interviews. It can be summarized with the final words of Ellis when he says to Bernstein, "It is merely an act of justice and a reasonable condition of social hygiene." Bernstein's treatment of this issue demonstrates the breadth of his interests. Then he goes to interview Maxim Kovalevsky. In his attempts to learn about the Jewish situation in Russia, Bernstein interviewed Maxim Kovalevsky. There, Kovalevsky describes the situation in Russia before the socialist revolution. Professor Kovalevsky had written in the time a book entitled "Jewish Rights and Their Enemies." He gives a clear picture of Russian policy towards Jews during the time of Peter the Great, Catherine II, and Alexander III. One of the interviews was also with Sheikh ul Islam, who in that time, when he took this interview, was head of all the Muslim world, and the interview is very interesting. Their conversation is a model of good understanding and desire for the coexistence of different religions. By the time Bernstein finished this diverse range of interviews, he had distinguished himself as a high-class intellectual and on the world stage. He continued with his agenda in the following activities. One of Bernstein's greatest works of polemics in his correspondence with Henry Ford, known to be an anti-Semite. That polemic is still an interesting subject for scholars in the United States. One of those who has elaborated on this story is Victoria Sacker-Woste, who, like Bernstein, has discussed Henry Ford's war on the Jews and the legal battles against hate speech. Here we find Bernstein revealing himself to be a great polemist and a true Jew who would defend his cause. Henry Ford has spread the news that had allegedly met Bernstein while traveling from the United States to Europe. He alleged that it was a journalist named Herman Bernstein who told him that the only way to finish the war was to watch the Jewish financiers who had created it. I played ignorance, says Ford. I did let him go. He gave me most of the things that I have published, continues him. This statement was strongly objected by Bernstein, whose position was later defended by many articles published in the Evening Post and the Herald. It's interesting that he persuaded Henry Ford to issue an apology after these polemics. It is documented that Henry Ford himself would later endorse Bernstein as a minister of the United States to Kingdom of Albania. The episode was a triumph for human rights and for the rights of minorities and small groups against the language of hatred. Bernstein won $200,000 as a fine for defamation from Henry Ford. After the Russian Revolution, Bernstein published a book which is named Willy Niki Telegrams. As you may know, Kaiser and the Russian Tsars in that time were second-generation cousins. One of the landmark achievements of Herman Bernstein is his discovery and publication of the so-called Willy Niki Telegrams. In his dedication, Bernstein wrote, "To all who are working to make the world safe for democracy and for a durable, righteous peace, this volume is sincerely dedicated." He gained possession of these super secret telegrams thanks to the work of some of his friends, including Professor Tarle and Vladimir Bortsev, two historians of the revolution. What makes this publication more important is the foreword by Theodore Roosevelt, then a former US president from 1901 to 1908, who wrote the following letter to Bernstein on November 6, 1917. "Dear Mr. Bernstein, I congratulate you on the noteworthy service you have rendered by this discovery and publication of these letters. These letters should be made familiar to all civilized people. They show, furthermore, the wicked folly of all who would now treat with the German despotism for a negotiated peace, a peace without victory, a peace into which the wrongdoer and the wronged would enter on equal terms." Let me repeat, my dear sir, says President Roosevelt, that in publishing these letters, you have rendered a signal service to this nation and to all mankind. Very sincerely yours, Theodore Roosevelt. Bernstein was a friend of President Woodrow Wilson. In 1919, Bernstein went to Paris with the American delegation as a journalist. He reported from Paris for many American newspapers. The story of the Paris Peace Conference is very important for Albania and is entirely linked to the position of the United States represented by President Wilson and to the contribution of an American missionary named Charles Telford Erickson. It was Charles Telford Erickson who informed President Wilson in daily briefs about Albania's story and why it was facing that situation. Erickson had known the wife of President Wilson, Edith Bolling Galt Wilson, because they both had worked for the International Red Cross. He took advantage of this connection and channeled through her all of the letters he was preparing on behalf of the Albanian delegation. In this way, he he succeeded in convincing President Wilson to declare that America would never sign a final document of the peace conference if the borders of Albania would be violated. This was the first of the two greatest contributions of the United States towards Albania and Albanians in the 20th century. The second was the liberation of Kosovo in 1999. When we analyze relations between Erickson and the American delegation led by President Wilson and between Erickson and Bernstein, we attain a better understanding of how these people worked for Albania. In the 30s, they both worked for American Albanian projects, Erickson as a missionary and Bernstein as a diplomat. In 1929, Herbert Hoover became the 31st President of the United States and would serve until 1933. It is worth mentioning that President Hoover had served as a Secretary of Commerce from 1921 to 1928. In 1925, he gave a donation of $10,000 on the condition of anonymity because it was considered a conflict of interest for the agricultural school of Kavaja in Albania, soon to be established by Charles Telford Erickson. That money was given from his personal account, something that was discovered only after Erickson's death in 1966. The relations between Hoover, Erickson, between Hoover and Bernstein, and afterwards Bernstein assumed his position in Tirana between Erickson and Bernstein have all had a long, enduring positive influence on Albanian-American relations. Regarding Herbert Hoover, a great man, Bernstein wrote his book, The Man Who Brought America to the World. Bernstein assumed his position as American minister to the Albanian kingdom on February 17, 1930. He presented his letters of credence to King Zog on April 28, 1930, and relinquished on September 24, 1933. His assignment was warmly welcomed by the Jewish organizations in the United States, and I would like to underline that Bernstein was the first Russian Jew to be assigned U.S. ambassador in a country. Being a very professional journalist and someone who had traveled all over the world, Bernstein was also a very good diplomat. So he not only worked as a diplomat for cabling everyday information, but also wrote articles about Albania in order to make its case an international one. So he explains in his diplomatic reports that why Albania is referred as the most dangerous zone in Europe, where a war is likely to start. He gives a picture of the country in such a beautiful way. He wrote, Albania has been called Europe's forgotten land, Cinderella among the nations, land of the paradox, key to the Adriatic Sea, and the Belgium of the Balkans. Albania's history dates back to the pre-Christian era, says Bernstein. The Albanians are believed to have descended from the ancient Illyrians. Alexander the Great of Macedon was a son of an Albanian princess. The town of Butrinti in southern Albania, where recent excavations brought back age-old scenes immortalized by Virgil, has a remarkable amphitheater more than 2,000 years old. Phoenix Hill near Saranda in southern Albania is surrounded by a series of massive walls, which makes the place one of the most highly fortified and largest acropolis of the classic world. Bernstein also writes about the situation in Albania. One of the articles is why Albania has lost face in Italy. Bernstein was very concerned about the influence of Duce on Albania and his dreams to expand the Italian territories beyond the Adriatic Sea on the east. In a large article, he tackles many subjects of Albanian-Italian relations. On September 5, 1933, Bernstein remarked, why is Italy so eager to restore cordial relations with that little country? The answer is that Albania, by geographical position, holds the key of the Adriatic Sea. Bernstein was one of the diplomats, probably rare diplomats, that has understood the religious tolerance in Albania. He went to Elbasan to attend a ceremony at the Orthodox monastery. He described the ceremony being attended by Christians, Muslims, and Bektashians alike. It showed perhaps the first and the only case in the world where people of the same nation of different religions attended such an interesting ceremony together. It has been God's will and our good fortune that even today Albanians celebrate together. Bernstein rightly ascertained that Albanians all share the common faith of Albanianism. This fact was reconfirmed on September 21, 2014, when Pope Francis visited Albania. More than 300,000 Albanians rushed down on the streets of Tirana, the Albanian capital, to greet the Holy Father, half of them being Muslims. The first true history about the King of Albania was written by Herman Bernstein. This history remained unknown for a long time, sealed up in the archives, and it was Dr. Elias Bibera, the Albanian-American and well-known journalist who works for the Voice of America, who first searched for Bernstein's account in this building at the YIVO archive in 1980. He published excerpts of the history in that time. King Zog and Ambassador Bernstein spoke about the possibility of establishing a Jewish place in Albanian territory in the time when Jews all over Europe were being faced with Nazi racism. Bernstein wanted to do something to create a safe haven for a significant number of Jews. Herman Bernstein was on good terms with King Zog. Herman Bernstein recorded the testimony of Joseph Matatia, a member of the City Hall of Lora. Among other things, he says that, based on hearsay, a Jewish colony emigrated here from Venice during the first Venetian occupation about 5 centuries ago. The Turks captured this country from Venetians, and the Jews fled from the occupation. When the Venetians captured this country, again the Jews returned. But when the Turks' second occupation took place, the Jews fled and went to all directions. Herman Bernstein was the one who has discovered the story of Sabbatai Tsevi, who, as you, I'm quite sure, know, he was proclaimed as the Messiah, and he was actually threatening the Sultan. He took him to Ulcini. Ulcini is a city now in the Montenegrin sovereignty, but in that time it was an Albanian city totally populated by the Albanians. Years later, Sabbatai Zevi was taken to Berati, and when he died, he had his tomb at the riverbank of Berati. And Bernstein was the one who has discovered this fact. Now, there are many books published about Sabbatai Zevi. There is a synagogue in Saranda, south of Albania, where Bernstein has its own contribution. He was interested in archaeological discoveries in the country. He had a personal acquaintance with the Italian archaeologist Luigi Maria Ugolini. Later on, the impressive remains of 5th or 6th century synagogue were uncovered by the Albanian Academy of Science and the Hebrew University Institute of Archaeology. I would like to add about this synagogue that it is said that there are 12 similar synagogues in the Balkans. One of them is in Saranda in Albania. Another one, only these two discovered, is in Plovdiv in Bulgaria. He was also a very good speaker, and he delivered always very eloquent speeches. On 200th anniversary of George Washington, Bernstein addresses to an audience in Albania. It is my privilege to celebrate this historic occasion in Albania, whose people suffered and struggled so long before they have attained their independence, and whose own hero, Skanderbeg, was one of the world's greatest personalities, both as a leader of men and as a champion of his people's independence. To celebrate this bicentennial birthday of George Washington, it is my honor and pleasure to dedicate the seeds of tree brought from Mount Vermont, the home of Washington, and plant them in Albanian soil on the grounds of American legation. The U.S. Embassy in Tirana was the first embassy building to have been erected by the American government in the world, so it is a historical building. The American legation was inaugurated on the day of Thanksgiving on November 27, 1930. Therefore, it is a historical place. Ambassador Bernstein inaugurated it in that year. He gives us a picture of the view as he could see it through his office window. The piece was published by the editor of the American Foreign Service Association. He writes, "From the windows of the new American legation in Tirana, one can see many fascinating sights which present a picture of Albanian life in all its variegated colors and shades. In front of the legation gates, the new road leads from Duracio to Elbasani and Korça. Duracia, on the Adriatic Sea, is the most important seaport, built about 700 years before the Christian era. Known in the past as Durahium, it witnessed scenes of glory, of bloody battles, of the conflicts between the armies of Caesar and Pompey, and of crusaders on their way to Holy Land. It is believed that there too St. Paul preached Christianity. America is popular in Albania for several reasons. Albania is grateful to America for the late President Wilson's aid given to the cause of Albanian independence at a very critical period during the peace conference. Other reasons for Albania's appreciation of America are the American schools in Tirana and Kavaja, conducted by the American Red Cross and Near East Foundation, and malaria work of the Rockefeller Foundation. Beyond these Alps is Kruja, the home of Skanderbeg, George Kastrioti, the Albanian George Washington, whose praise was sung by Longfellow in his Tales of Wayside Inn. From my window I see the famous road Via Egnatia. Bernstein was a very close friend of the most prominent Albanian intellectuals. I'll mention only a few of them. He had strong relations with Lef Nossi, who is one of the founders of the new Albanian state. Lef Nossi was a Christian Orthodox from Elbasani and had promised Bernstein to give him a script of Jewish history or their historical presence in his town. He perused the manuscripts of Evliya Çelebi, a famous Turkish traveler who recorded everything during his trip in Albania in the 16th century. Lef Nossi provided evidence of the Jews who were mostly sojourners in the city of Elbasan. The history of relations between Lef Nossi and the Jews in Albania is a tragic one. During the time of Nazi occupation, Lef Nossi sheltered a Jewish family in his house. The family was safe until the communists took power in Albania at the end of 1944. A few weeks after the war, the communist police were chasing Nossi because he was considered an anti-communist. Lef went into hiding. He thought that he might obtain shelter at the Jewish family he had helped when they were in a similar plight. The Jewish family sheltered him for some days, but later on, the communists discovered him and arrested, later executing him without a trial. Bernstein had also very good relations with George Fishta, a priest who is considered like the Albanian modern Homer. It is interesting to mention that he had relation with Alexander Masiu, who in that time was a great, great Albanian actor playing in the Burgtheater of Vienna. Masiu was a famous Albanian Austrian actor. He played Hamlet and Macbeth. He wrote a drama in German named The Prisoner, dedicated to Napoleon Bonaparte. Herman Bernstein translated it into English. It is interesting to see how Bernstein maintained strong ties with Albanian intellectuals, not only in Albania, but also abroad. The translation was done by Herman Bernstein and his daughter, Dorothy. He also had very good relation with Faik Konica, who was ambassador of Albania to Washington, D.C. at the same time with Bernstein in Albania. When he finished his tenure in Albania, Bernstein was given many receptions, warm farewell parties, etc. I'd like to bring to you a speech of Bernstein in one of these days, which is beautiful and a little bit funny. The final days of Bernstein were full of activities. One of them was held at the Continental Hotel in Tirana on September 13, 1933. His Albanian friends made kind speeches. Bernstein surprised everyone with following speech. The other day, I received a letter from America containing a newspaper clipping in which my resignation as American minister to Albania was announced. Though the text of the news item was correct, the headline stated that I had died. Mr. Perry, director of the National Committee on Education by Radio of Washington, wrote to me as follows. I was very sorry to see in the paper yesterday that you had died. It is bad enough that you should resign the post which you have occupied with such distinguished ability. But to have you resign and die is just too much. I hope that you are finding your life in the hereafter pleasant, and that I may have the pleasure of meeting you again after your return to New York. My answer to Mr. Perry was like this, Bernstein says. I was indeed glad to get your note from the other world. If this is the hereafter, it has no terrors for me. I'm rather enjoying it. It is cool here just now. The roses are in bloom again, and the mountains are bathed in fascinating purple at sunset. The headlines in the Columbus, Ohio, Call Journal of August 28, announcing my death, says Bernstein, in reporting my resignation as the American minister to Albania, amused me. Mark Twain had been prematurely pronounced dead once. Bernstein was given the Star and Knight's Cross of the Order of Skanderbeg by King Zog of Albania. Also he was awarded by the George Washington Bicentennial Commission for the good work that he had done in Albania. And he never ceased until he died working for Albania, even when he left Albania. One of his contribution is that he has written an article named Albania, the Pound of Main Powers. Unfortunately, he didn't live that long after he left Albania. He went on contributing, telling the truth about the country through the most prestigious newspapers of the world, such as New York Times. The following article was a predictive narrative of Albania's future, which less than 6 years later would be invaded by Italians. This shows Bernstein's brilliance as a diplomat whose knowledge about the country made him able to predict the future. Little Albania has thus become a pawn in the game of the two conflicting blocs in European diplomacy, one headed by Italy and the other one by France, says Bernstein in that time. Conclusion. Bernstein is an important figure for Albanian-American relations. He advocated for the small country learning about its history and culture, writing articles about its history, helping to open schools, and warning the world about its tragic future. Bernstein is also an important figure of Jewish and American history. He is one of the greatest intellectuals to become US ambassador. Bernstein set a vital precedent for Jewish and Albanian relations. He discovered and wrote about the profound values of the Albanian nation, such as Besa and hospitality, the complete absence of anti-Semitism amongst Albanians, and their historical, religious and ethnic tolerance, which is still alive and an example for the world today. Bernstein died in 1935, leaving behind a greater legacy for Albania related to the great sympathy of the Albanian people for the Jews and their veneration for the United States, which will continue on for decades to come. After Bernstein's death, King Zog of Albania instructed all Albanian consular missions in Europe to grant visas to any Jew faced with threat of German persecution. This is something that made us very, very proud. Hundreds of Jews made their way out of the Nazi inferno to find heaven in Albania. Herman Bernstein's fingerprints is clearly visible in this remarkable human story. There is perhaps no more appropriate summary of Bernstein's life than the statement released by the Pan-Albanian American Federation, VATRA, whose many members are here today, on the eve of his departure from Albania. Herman Bernstein is in himself is a personality that captures the people's hearts. There are persons who are the typical representatives of their race and their nation. We speak of the distinguished type of our time, the European lord, the English gentleman, the American sportsman. Mr. Bernstein is the universal man. He was a member of a race renowned for great mental aptness and high ideals, but persecuted and tortured by the blind fanaticism and wild chauvinism of demented nations. Bernstein was experienced with the difficulties of this harsh life, and then was brought up in the circles of his time, most distinguished intellectuals, and was nourished with the liberty-loving principles of the nation of Abraham Lincoln. He knows the world with its two sides, the dark and the bright. He is one of the pioneer citizens of the world. Thank you very much for your attention. Many of you are aware of the movie Besa the Promise. Together with the staff of YIVO, we have thought that it would be good to show only the trailer, which takes no more than 2 or 3 minutes.
How many people would lay down their lives for a stranger?
Got it, got it.
Albanians would. Hello, I'm Roman Gershman. Very pleased to meet you. Your family rescued this Jewish family under the Nazis. You're Muslims, is that correct?
Yeah.
It was this collective agreement amongst the people to save people.
Emri im është Recep Hoxha.
Babai nuk vetëm dëshironte që për hebrejt të kryente veprimin që I mbeti si kështu pa realizuar.
Lama e aurim shilia suet të dëvarazi. Zeme na kjerli ata jo.
For 60 years he's got these books, but they must be returned.
Edhe në kulturën tonë, themi kur t'jepet një amanet, që thuhet një detyrim, besa është edhe tek kjo, tek fjala e dhënë.
The journey was almost a year to find this Jewish family.
Kur një njeri jeton gjatë me këtë ide dhe që erdhi u afruam në zgjidhje. U afruam drejt zgjidhjes, besoj. Është shumë e bukur.
This is not a fiction. This is a true story. Dr. Brent, you remember when I came to your office in March of this year, you were so generous to help me to get all the documentation of Herman Bernstein. I couldn't do anything else but putting everything in this USB. I would like to give it to you, and you probably can use it for the records of Herman Bernstein's paper vis-à-vis Albania. Thank you very much. Also, being that fond of this great Jewish figure, American figure, I worked on a brochure, so my presentation is printed out, and as Herman mentioned before, on the way out you can get one copy just to remember this 14th day of December 2014. Thank you very much for being here today.
We're going to take a couple of questions from the audience, so please raise your hand if you have any questions. Somebody in the back, up in the back. Oh, right here? Okay, go ahead.
Why did Herman Bernstein resign as ambassador in 1933?
Well, I believe all the ambassadors have a fixed term of 4 years. He was about to complete 4 years, but most probably because he was assigned by President Hoover, and Hoover was about to finish his term, he did too.
I have a simple question.
All right.
Could he speak Albanian?
Not sure about it, I haven't seen anything. But I see that at Gjergj Fishta, the Albanian Homer, has written to him in Albanian. So the note is in Albanian.
Is there a question back here?
Any other one?
Sir.
Thank you. What happened to King Zog? Did he survive the war, and what did he do after the war?
Oh, very good question. As I mentioned, Bernstein wrote an article to New York Times in 1934, right after he left Albania. And he has predicted in such a fantastic way. And being a diplomat in such a good post in London, I always see him as an example. But I think there are few diplomats in the world, probably Henry Kissinger might be similar to him, that has predicted years before what happened. King Zog of Albania was dethroned in 1939, on 7th of April, when the Italians invaded Albania. Then he used to live in exile until 1961 when he died. His family was living here and there in different European and finally at the south of Africa, Johannesburg. But now they are in Albania. The prince of the crown is in Albania. Harry?
Mr. Ambassador. Thank you
for bringing to the forefront about Ambassador Bernstein. You honor us with this information that, for generations to come to learn the friendship between the Albanian people and the Jewish people. Thank you very much for this honor.
Thank you, Harry, for being here. Thank you very much. More? I don't see anyone.
Thank you for taking the time to share with us today, Ambassador. I would love to hear a little bit more about the Albanian experience of the risks they took in protecting the Jews and how they were able to do that when almost it was so rare for any country to be able to do that. If you could speak to that a little bit.
Thank you for your question. Well, it is not based on any governmental organization or non-governmental organization. That's inside of the Albanian spirit. I would tell you a very short story. One of my friends of my age told me a story when I was a student, that his family had sheltered some Jews. Actually, his Jewish story in Albania was not that much known within the country during the communism. He said that my grandfather sheltered some 7 Jews of the same family in Kruja. Kruja is a city about 30 kilometers north of Albania, Tirana. And he said that in September of 1944, the Germans left the city, so all the residents rushed downtown and they started to celebrate, and the Jewish family also went with them. But a few days later, Germans came back again. So the Jews were very much scared that someone would spy to Germans and they come and arrest them. So they wanted to move from the family. The family had another old house somewhere at the foot of mountains above the city. And the Albanian from Korea said to the Jewish family, I'm going to take you to that old house, I'll bring you food and everything, and you don't have to care about that, you'll be in a safe place. I said that, well, what if the Germans would come and put the house in fire, so you are all dead? And he said, well, nobody's coming there, I assure you, but finally, because the Jewish family was so scared, he said, look, I have only one son. My son is coming to live with you. If the house is put in fire, my son is dead with you. That's the way how they have. So it was the Albanian population, peasants, residents of the cities, that they took care about them. Not because they have been forced by anyone, but because of this besa that I mentioned, which is, if someone knocks on the Albanian door, it seems to be a bit primitive or probably strange, but I'd like to compare 2 things that has happened recently. If someone knocks on the door of an Albanian, from the very moment when you open the door, you are responsible for him or for her. If someone touches him, if someone violates him, you are responsible. You have to give shelter, food, and protection. It is totally different with that kind of behavior which has a name, intrusion. A few months ago, I heard that a lady who was driving a car somewhere here in the United States, the very late night, probably 4 o'clock in the morning, he ran into an accident. She left the car and went and knocked on the door of a family. You know what happened? The owner of the house killed her by weapon. This is totally opposite. If you knock on the door of an Albanian, he is or she is obliged to take care about you until the very moment when you leave the house. Anything else?
Thank you so much for coming today. During the communist period, were all religions treated in the same negative manner, or was there special negative treatment to Jews?
Well, in 1967, the Albanian communist government decided to declare Albania, first country in the world, an atheist state, which means that no religion were allowed to be practicing. There was any discrimination against the Jews, because neither Muslims, nor Christians, nor Orthodox were allowed to practice. We know some of the Jews who were living in Albania until 1990. They were treated equally with all the other people. No discrimination because of their Judaism or because they were Jews. The group of Albanian Jews in 1990 were all together, went to Israeli. There was a family of Joseph Jacoel. His daughter has graduated from the Academy of Arts of Albania. She's a musician. Her name is Felicita Jacoel. She was the one who has organized the so-called exodus of the Jews after the collapse of communism. Not because of persecution, but Albania lost almost half of its own population after the collapse of communism due to the very difficult economic situation that where people were living at the time.
You mentioned the role of Herbert Hoover and United States aid after World War I and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. So Bernstein was Hoover's ambassador. How did the U.S. influence of using aid and using connections in the interwar period affect the attitude of the Albanian people via the fascists, and has there been a vacuum left from the absence of U.S. presence and U.S. aid that is being filled by Turkey or other countries now?
You mean the absence of the U.S. in Albania?
U.S. aid and influence.
Well, as you may know, in 1939, Albania was invaded by Italians. So the embassy continued to be open until September of 1939. In that time, U.S. government decided to close the mission in Albania, and all the things were packed on the basement. It's very interesting that in 1992, when the embassy was taken back by the Americans, they found out everything that the staff of Hugh Grant, who was the ambassador in that time, was left. There was a vacuum in relation between Albania and the United States only during the time of communism. But after the collapse and before the occupation of Italians, we have been always in very good relation. I have here a gentleman who just saw that he is in audience, Dr. John Buchay. He is the president of the Pan-Albanian American Federation, which was established before Albania became an independent state in 1912. And this federation, named VATRA, has played a very crucial role to maintain excellent relation between the United States and Albania. I think that's me. There is a gentleman there. Well, it reached about 800,000 people. 800,000 people. Now it is about roughly 3 million.
Ambassador, I believe you mentioned that King Zog issued his invitation to Jews fleeing Nazi persecution after Ambassador Bernstein's death.
Yes.
Was there any specific actions that Ambassador Bernstein had taken that led King Zog to make that invitation?
Yes, yes. There are documents that show that King Zog and Herman Bernstein were in very close, in very, very good terms. And they have discussed, there are documents they have discussed two things. One, to create a safe haven, probably giving a territory of Albanian state to a group of Jews who might come when they are in serious stake. The other thing is that all the consular missions, we have documents in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that King Zog has instructed through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Albania, all the consular missions in Europe to issue visa for the Jews. Scarlett Epstein was the witness of this fact. When she left Vienna with the family, they went to Yugoslavia. She used to live for 3 months in Zagreb. Then in Zagreb, the Yugoslavian authorities wanted the family to deport to Germany or Austria in that time. And she knocked on the door of several consular missions in Zagreb. But every door, as she told me, was shut down in the face. Someone told her, "Why don't you try Albania?" She said, "Albania? I don't know, where is Albania? Is there an Albania in this world?" They said, "Yes, but there is a trade office of Albania which is tasked with the consular affairs too." And she said, "I went to the door of the small office and I knocked on the door. The gentleman was very handsome. He was suddenly was only 15 years old. And he opened the door and said, 'Yes, what can I do for you?' She said, 'I need a visa to go to Albania.' 'Okay, come on in.' I said, 'Yes, but, you know, I have a passport with a big red J on one of the pages.' So what? 'I am a Jew.' 'So what? Come on in.' And the gentleman instructed her to go and collect all the passports of the family, father, mother, and 2 brothers. And they made the way from Zagreb to Split, and as I think I mentioned, to Durrësi, and they stayed there up to sometimes after the Italian occupation. Then they made the way to Great Britain.
Thank you very much for coming, everyone. We have a reception outside, and an usher will hand you a booklet as you exit. Thank you.